It gives me great pleasure to welcome Alva Noe to Providence and to Brown, particularly since we're philosophical siblings. We share a dissertation advisor. I thought it might be useful to take just 60 seconds to talk a little bit about Alva's prior work. I think it will provide a context, or I hope it will provide a context that might be useful in seeing what's happening today. So in his first book, which is one of those very rare books that are read both by philosophers and by psychologists, in his first terrific book, Action and Perception, Alva defended the view that our perceptual experience of the world depends constitutively on our ability to act in various ways. More specifically, he argued that our perceptual grasp of an external object depends on what he called sensory motor knowledge, knowledge of how objects would appear to us if we were to move in various ways. Our grasp of an object at any one moment is highly perspectival. We can only see the facing surface of the object, and we can only see it from a certain distance and a certain angle of view. Alva maintained that we can only transcend this perspectival character of perception and achieve contact with the objective physical structure of objects by adopting new vantage points. And to do that, we must move in some way. To have a full perceptual grasp of the object is to know how the object would look to us if we were to move closer and farther away, move to the right and to the left, and also to walk around it. For this reason, our perceptual grasp of an object is dependent on our bodies and our ability to act in various ways. Our perceptual knowledge is sensory motor in character. So that was a terrific book. In subsequent writings, Alva has extended the idea that perception is action-dependent to mental states and mental processes generally, even to what is often regarded as the most internal aspect of the mind, consciousness itself, and has maintained more positively that the cognition is constituted by the ability to act and dispose our bodies. But now it's power to this view that the power of neuroscience to illuminate the mind is limited. The focus should instead be beyond the whole person, including the body's ability to act on the world, and the social interactions that speech and other forms of external behavior make possible. So Alva's writing a new book, I'm not sure, maybe he'll say when it'll be out, to be called Strange Tools, Art in the Guise of Nature, in which he'll be carrying this program forward. And I think we're going to get a taste of that book in his remarks today.
Thank you very much, Chris Hill. And thanks to the organizers for having me. It's a real treat and an honor to be here. I am going to be discussing new work, but I will also combine it with some earlier ideas as well, touching on some of the themes that were just mentioned. What is art? Why does art matter to us? What does art tell us about ourselves? These are our questions. These days, it is the trend to approach these questions in the key of neuroscience. Neuroscience seems to many of us to hold the secret to our nature and to so much of what we value. In my presentation today, and indeed in this larger project that I'm hard at work on, I take a different approach. Not because I balk at bringing art into contact with or dialogue with or indeed collaboration with science, not because I think somehow the work of artists should be insulated from the problems of biology, but rather because I'm not satisfied that neuroscience, as it is thought of not by those here, but by many people, that neuroscience does not have the resources to frame an adequate conception of human nature, that it doesn't have the resources to frame an adequate conception of our biological nature. In my talk today, I'm going to, in the first part, take some moves towards sketching what I think a more adequate approach would look like. But in the remainder of the talk, I will try to say something explicitly about the limits of neuroscience. That's the part of the talk I usually don't get to, but I'm really going to make an effort to get to it today, because those remarks I prepared explicitly thinking about the people in this audience. I'll just say that, in a way, one of the bottom line, the point I may not really get to today because it's bigger than the context of this talk, but my guiding thought, ultimately, is that art is a philosophical practice, that art is a research practice, indeed that art and philosophy are species of a common genus, which I'll call reorganizational practices. I'll try to give some indication of what I mean by that. And at least ultimately part of the reason why I'm skeptical of the value of the application of the methods of neuroscience to the project of art is for similar reasons, for the same kind of reasons that I would be skeptical to thinking that neuroscience could solve the problems of philosophy. But to begin with, I'd like to ask you to consider for a moment the fact that we are mammals, and that it is the distinctive, the defining, the hallmark feature of the mammals that we suckle at the breast. And I'd like to just take a moment to think with you about breastfeeding. Suitable place to chuckle. It turns out the literature on breastfeeding shows that humans, among the mammals, are really bad at breastfeeding. We are the worst breastfeeders. Most mammals, when they begin to suck at the breast, will suck until they're full, until they're sated, until their needs are met. But not the human infant. The human infant drifts off to sleep or gets distracted and needs to be coaxed and helped to achieve the task of nourishing itself at the breast. So bad are human beings at breastfeeding that some anthropologists and developmental psychologists have speculated that the purpose of breastfeeding is not to feed us. Rather, we feed that way in order to achieve some other end. For example, and there's speculation about what this might be, but for example, the end of establishing a certain kind of attachment relationship. Be that as the case may be, the fact is that breastfeeding turns out to have a fantastically interesting structure. Baby suckles, baby stops suckling, feeder, mother, notices that the baby has gotten distracted, jiggles the baby, spontaneously jiggles the baby without any special maternal training. In doing that, draws the baby back to the task at hand. Baby sucks some more, baby falls asleep, or baby startled, and so on and so forth. Now I'd like to ask you to think, to try to bring this phenomenon of the breastfeeding in focus. I'd like to call attention to 6 features that I think this activity of breastfeeding displays. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. The first is that it's basic, it's biological, it's natural, it's spontaneous, if anything is. The second feature of breastfeeding to which I want to direct your attention is that, despite that fact, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated activity. It's cognitively sophisticated. It's psychologically sophisticated. It involves looking, listening, perceiving, noticing, responding, doing, acting, undergoing to what is done on the part of both the mother and the infant. It's a very subtle cognitive display of sophistication. Third, breastfeeding exhibits a striking temporal dynamics, a spatial dynamics. It's an activity spread out in time. It's been noticed that breastfeeding in some ways has the structure of turn-taking. And it's interesting that the linguistic species is the species for whom breastfeeding evolves into this process of turn-taking. It's almost like a primitive conversation. Another interesting feature about breastfeeding is that although it has this structure, it's not directed or authored or governed by any one of the 2 parties in the feeding activity. Obviously, mother has a lot more control than the baby, but its dynamics are not scripted. They emerge. A 5th feature of breastfeeding is that it obviously serves some functions, although what those functions are is a subject for us to investigate. Maybe it fulfills attachment. Obviously, it facilitates nourishment and growth. And finally, and obviously, so obviously that I actually forgot to mention this the first few times I started thinking about this and talking about it, is breastfeeding can be, needn't be, but can be pleasurable. It can be a site for pleasure. Now I want to introduce a technical term, which I will call organized activity. And I will define an organized activity as any activity which exhibits these 6 features. It's basic and spontaneous, it's biological, it's natural, 1. It's nevertheless cognitively sophisticated, 2. It exhibits very distinctive temporal dynamics, 3. It's not authored by the participants in it, but it somehow just happens. It has a function, and it may be pleasurable. And once you get this category of the organized activity in view, it turns out that our life is replete with organized activities. In fact, we are organized left, right, and center, up, down, in, and out in these kinds of activities. In fact, in some ways, our lives are complex nestings of organized activities inside organized activities. Think of conversation. We like in the Western philosophical tradition to think of conversation as the intellectual transmission of my thought to you, and you understand it and decode it and so on. But in fact, when 2 people talk, they engage, and this is well studied, they engage in this fantastically complicated organized activity. Their posture, their volume, their eye movements, the dialects that they use, all of this gets entrained by the situation in which they find themselves in. In Action and Perception, the book that Chris referred to, I argued that perceptual experience was a temporally extended activity of exploring the world, making use of sensory motor knowledge. I just throw that mouthful out because I'm now, in my latest work, trying to go a step further towards analyzing what that might be, towards thinking of perception itself as a organized activity in these sense. Every time you move, you produce sensory events. When you move around an object, its profile changes. We constantly, we closely sensorially couple to the world around us when we perceive it, and I think it's useful to think of it as perception itself as a organized activity in my sense. One interesting feature about organized activities is I don't think that organized activities are best analyzed at the individual neurological level, although obviously they have all sorts of neural substrates. Nor do I think that they're best analyzed at the level of conscious, deliberate action. Rather, I think they're best analyzed at the level of what Dana Ballard, and following Dana Ballard, Linda Smith, have called the embodiment level. It's the level of sort of intelligible, low-scale, couple-of-second-long body movements. Seems to be the crucial level at which organized activities unfold. Okay. Now, here's another. Actually, let me just make one comment before I go on. I said that our lives are everywhere organized. But it's very interesting, and here's the philosopher speaking, it's very interesting to notice that although our lives are organized, we are ourselves not the authors of that organization, nor are we sort of knowledgeable. We don't have a perspicuous overview of that organization. It's a sort of fact about the human condition that we are organized and we just find ourselves organized. And one of the thoughts I have is that it also becomes a puzzle, indeed a source of anxiety to ourselves, to get clear about how we are organized. And that's going to play an important role in the story. Okay, next, here's another organized activity, dancing. I think, given the criteria that I've laid out, it's pretty plausible that dancing is an organized activity. It seems to be spontaneous and natural, which is not to say that it's not also cultural. And it's an arena in which we look and listen and respond and pay attention and notice and communicate. It clearly involves its own temporal dynamics. When dancing is happening, it's just happening, and the dancers get swept up in the dance. I think it's very plausible, thinking about it anthropologically, thinking about it psychologically, that dancing performs all sorts of socially important functions. If you think of dance in a ritual context, in a mating context, in a seduction context, in a play context, dancing does some kind of work for us. And then, obviously, dancing can be pleasurable. So dancing is an organized activity, in my sense. All right? But now the question I want to ask you is this. What about choreography? And when the first thought you might have is that, well, choreographers make dances. That's what they do. But if I'm right, dances aren't the kinds of things that you make. That is, dancings are the sort of things that happens. We get caught up in dancing. Dancing takes place. We find ourselves dancing. So my thought is that whatever we say about choreography, we should recognize that the choreographer isn't simply just doing more dancing. The choreographer isn't simply doing more of that organized activity. So what is the choreographer doing? Well, you might say the choreographer is staging a dance, which is to say representing a dance, which is to say putting dancing, or the fact that we are dancers, on display. Or to go a step further, what I would argue is that the choreographer is in effect investigating dancing, examining it, exploring its foundations, exploring its place in our lives, and indeed helping us find ourselves as ones who, as it happens, are dancers. So why is choreography important? Not for any other particular reason than the fact that we are dancers. And I want to suggest that choreography here is a stand-in for art. I'm talking about choreography, but I might talk about any other of the artistic disciplines. And the thought then is that we can immediately see a way in which art has, on the one hand, an interesting tie to what is now, in an extended sense, biology. If it is a fact about our condition that we are organized in these ways, and if choreography is, in some sense, putting this fact about ourselves on display and exhibiting it for our reflection, then in an admittedly somewhat novel and extended sense, choreography is making a contribution to our understanding of our own biology. And second of all, so the first point here is that there's a link between choreography and biology, or art and biology. And then second of all, I think that there is a striking and interesting, and now I hope more obvious, sense in which this work that the choreographer is doing is distinctively, characteristically, paradigmatically philosophical work. Wittgenstein said that the form of a philosophical problem is, I don't know my way around, I'm lost. And on this view, precisely what the choreographer or the artist is doing is bringing into view, or bringing into open, to use a Heideggerian idea, that which is concealed, or that which is hidden from view. So the picture that emerges, and this is, I'm condensing what is really the argument of well, a very big, long argument of a book into a very brief summation. But the thought is that roughly we can think of our lives as organized at the first order by a whole range of activities: dancing, talking, seeing, but also transactions involving pictures and other technologies. These technologies are hubs of picture making, for example, are hubs of organization, and we find ourselves organized. What we call the arts are then, if you like, second-order level investigations of those first-order modes of organization, which are essential to our human being. And they take their importance from that fact, from the fact that we are organized, and that the modes in which we find ourselves organized are defining of what we are and who we are. Now, this image of first order, second order, I think is apt. It gives you the flavor of the view, the structure of the view, but it immediately needs to be made more complicated, made more messy. And for two obvious reasons. The first is that, if I'm right, the second order arises out of urges or problems that are lived or felt at the first order. That is, the reason why an artist is drawn to be a painter is not just in order to make a better picture, but in some sense to get clear about what it is to make a picture, getting clear about pictoriality. And the reason why a choreographer choreographs, and by the way, I'm not talking about what they would say in their autobiography were their reasons, but that in which the value of their work consists stems in its putting on display the place of dancing in our lives. Actually, there's an interesting footnote to make there. In the 20th century, a great deal of choreography doesn't start from dancing, but starts from problems about movement on the stage. But for the sake of argument now, I'm just going to focus on dancing, but I might have said movement instead of dancing. So the first point is that the second order emerges out of anxieties that we know at the first order. And the second point, and then this is the really interesting one, is that the second order loops back down and changes the way we feel about life at the first order. That is, in a world in which there is choreography, people dance different. It's impossible to dance without those images of whether it's Michael Jackson or James Brown or Baryshnikov in your mind when you're doing it. That is to say, if you think of what the second order is doing as modeling what we do at the first order, the availability of the models then becomes a normative standard in terms of which we understand our activity at the first order, our organized activity. I think that one of the most interesting illustrations of this phenomenon is the relation of writing to speech. It's true that speech is a lot older than writing. This is something that linguists like to remind us. But our conception of language isn't that much older than writing. Or rather, our conception of language is shaped by the model of writing. And I think there's no doubt that the existence of writing and the kinds of normative standards and ways of reflecting on and amplifying what it is we do when we talk that writing allows change the way we talk. I'm speaking textually now. I'm not just talking, even though I'm not reading, even though I'm not actually following a written text. The thought there is that the second order loops back down to the first order and reorganizes it. So this is why I want to say that art is a reorganizational practice, a kind of research practice bent on reorganization. Whereas dancing or doodling or talking are not reorganizational practices. Those are organized activities, modes of organization within which we find ourselves. Now, let me, before I now turn to the part I wanted to discuss that's critical of neuroaesthetic approaches, let me just make one observation. One of the resources that this framework, I think, gives is that it allows us to make sense of a whole variety of ways in which art and its value isn't usefully summed up in thinking about simple aesthetic responses or aesthetic experiences. One is well, the whole question of why art matters. I'd like to suggest that art matters in very much the kind of way that philosophy matters. People like to think, by the way, that philosophy is a dry intellectual discipline. In fact, I think philosophy is a very hot discipline. It stems from there are emotions. There are emotions attached to the ideas and puzzles and quandaries that philosophers face. And I think art participates in that. And ultimately, the questions that art is engaging, like philosophy, are existential. They have existential significance. And that's where the burn comes from. That's where the heat comes from. I think another feature that this general framework for thinking about art offers is it lets us see why, and this is an interesting thing if you look at this from another point of view. It's hard to understand, I think, from another point of view. Why is it that we fight about art? Why is it that we disagree in our aesthetic responses? And when we disagree in our aesthetic responses, we demand that these disagreements be taken seriously. I'll talk about that in a few more minutes in relation to Kant. Here's another feature of art that I think is almost never noticed, but it strikes me as one of the most salient and abiding features of art. I grew up in a family of artists. I'm fluent with the art world. I've always felt myself sort of intimate with art making, art world, art showing. And I mention that just because, despite that fact, I have never met anything so boring in my life as art. Art is liable to be boring. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, I often had the experience of being bored on a summer day when there's no activity and you're just sort of at your wit's end. The closest I've ever come to feeling that kind of febrile boredom is when being stuck at the audience of a show or entering a gallery where yet again there are pictures on the wall that somehow I need to see and to perceive. I think that this is a really interesting fact. Why is art boredom? And I don't think that the boringness of art is a symptom that the art is bad, any more than I think that the boringness of a teacher is a symptom that the teacher is a bad teacher. That is to say, I think art makes challenges of a quasi-cognitive variety. And you have to, if you like, you have to turn the art on, to use a term that Bevil used a few times, by interrogation, by action, not just by. You don't just get it just because there you are and there it is. Seeing art, bringing it into focus, requires work. Actually, one of my titles of the talk was "See Me If You Can." In a way, my thought there is that the work of art has a general form. The general form of the work of art is "See me if you can." And unfortunately, it's not straightforward. And this has nothing to do with the difference between 20th century art versus old art. Art is nothing but a thing. It's nothing, or just a performance, just people moving on the stage until you bring it into focus. And that takes time, that takes work. We were talking over lunch about the way in which the choreographer, Jonathan Burroughs, believes that choreographers and audiences, in a sense, enter a contract to a relationship with each other. And the contract is that I, the choreographer, will give you, the audiences, the resources to figure out something meaningful that you're seeing. Because it doesn't look that way at first glance, especially contemporary dance, but not only contemporary dance. Go to a Balanchine classical ballet and find the meaning in it. You have to do a lot of work, but you can do it. So the work of art gives you that opportunity to do it and gives you that opportunity to catch yourself in the act of doing it. This is very much like the kind of boredom we face when we're trying to read philosophy. Why should we be asking this philosophical question? After all, either nobody knows or we already know, and why the interest in the dialogue, in the dialectic? Well, because we're not interested in the bottom line. We're interested in the activity of trying to make sense of the world around us. So the general, Wittgenstein once said that the general form of a proposition is such and such is the case. My view is that the general form of the work of art is see me if you can. And by the way, contrast that with the general form of dancing, right? When Tony Manero in Saturday Night Fever is dancing, he's not saying see me if you can, try and bring me into focus despite how hard it is. Rather, he's saying check me out. I'm showing off. Look how beautiful I am. Look how masculine I am. Look how virile I am. Look how achieved I am as a human being. Look how actualized I am as a human being. Look how charming I am. See me. The artist doesn't say see me, and the work of art doesn't see me. It says transform yourself. And I think that transformation is just like the transformation that happens at the beginning of between the beginning and the end of a philosophical text. Now, part of the problem, I think, with using neuroscience as a domain for studying art is that it is straitjacketed, not, in my view, by the methods of science, but rather by certain unquestioned, unacknowledged philosophical assumptions. That each of us is a brain in a vat. Now that I'm looking at a text, I'm speaking into the microphone in a way which is creating feedback. Each of us is a brain in a vat of flesh or bone, flesh and bone, or to change the image, that we are like submariners in a windowless craft afloat in a dark ocean of energy. We know nothing of what there is around us except what shows up on our internal screens. Crucially, this picture, you are your brain, is not a result of neuroscience. At best, it is a conception that many neuroscientists have taken for granted from the start. Can you still hear me now that I've shifted the microphone? The abiding idea here is that the world is a domain of we know not what, that acts on the nervous system, and is screened off, the world that is, by its own effects. We find ourselves on this side of the wall of effects, separating world and mind. We know things not as they are in themselves, we know only our brain's internal fabrications of them. Now, although it is true that the world acts on us, triggering events in the nervous system, it is also true that we act right back. Every movement of the eye, head, and body changes the character of our sensory coupling to the world around us. Objects, then, are less triggers for internal events in the nervous system than they are opportunities or affordances for our ongoing transaction with them. The world shows up in experience, I believe, not like a picture in the head. It shows up rather as the playing field or arena for our activity. Not the brain's activity, our activity. Not activity inside our head, but the activity, our whole embodied environmentally and socially situated activity in the world around us. My claim is not that the brain is not necessary. The claim is that our lives do not unfold in our brains. Instead of thinking of the creator brain that builds up the virtual world in which we find ourselves in our heads, think of the brain's job as enabling us to achieve access to the places where we find ourselves and the stuff we share those places with. Far from it being the case that we can explain art from the standpoint of neuroscience, I believe that the order of explanation may go just the other way around. That is, it may be that a better understanding of art will give us the resources to articulate a more plausible conception of ourselves, one suitable, finally, for making for a better neuroscience. Indeed, art, I will argue, should be viewed not so much as a phenomenon, I have been arguing, not so much as a phenomenon like digestion or eyesight that requires explanation, but as itself a mode of investigation, a style of research into the very questions that interest us. Now, if you're at all sympathetic to the kind of criticism that I'm evincing about the use of neuroscience and its methods to understand art, then you'll perhaps find it plausible that neuroaesthetics is just another instance of neuroscience's intellectual imperialism, just another episode in neuroscience's attempt to come up with a brain-based theory of everything. But in fact, I think neuroscience's recent preoccupation with art reveals something deeper and more fundamental in the neuroscientific project. Nowhere does this come out more clearly than in visual neuroscience and the primacy accorded to the retinal image. Visual consciousness, what we really see, is given by a picture in the brain. Marr called this picture the 2.5D sketch, and I know Marr wrote a long time ago. I know it's an old text, but it seems to really give expression to ideas that are very much alive today. Marr called this the 2.5D sketch. That is, it's the array of point light intensities on the retina, but transformed, in effect, into a line drawing in which boundaries between objects are marked out. Vision may enable us to gain knowledge of a 3D world, but it does so, it's widely stated, by giving us this 2.5D experience. Seeing a cube from this standpoint is having a picture of the cube, in effect a line drawing in your brain. And this in turn makes it clear why we experience a cube when we look at a line drawing of one. For the visual brain, a line drawing is a cube's neural equivalent. This follows from the inexorable logic that the cube itself in its 3D dimensionality is screened off by the optics of projection. The best we can have in sight is how things look from here. That is, the best we can have in vision is the cube's 2D or 2.5D projection. Neuroaesthetics, then, or at least the theory of pictures, pictoriality, depiction, is in play for neuroscience, at least visual neuroscience, from the very beginning. So in a way, it is, from the standpoint of neuroscience, to state the obvious, as Patrick Kavanagh did, to argue that insofar as artists are in the business of making effective pictures, they are investigating the brain itself. It is, after all, the fact that we see a cube when presented with a line drawing of one that shows that, for the visual brain at least, a line drawing of a cube is as good as a cube. And it is the fact that we don't immediately notice mistakes, Kavanagh argues, in a painter's rendering of shadows that shows that the brain is not governed by a knowledge of physics in constructing its visual world. And Kavanagh points out that if we really saw the world in 3D, then pictures would look jarring and inaccurate when we move, but they don't. And the fact that they don't shows that we don't see the world in 3D after all. One noteworthy upshot of the neural equivalence of representation and that of representations and that which they represent is the fact that objects themselves, with all their specific tangible substantiality, play almost no role in neuroscience. If you want to study object perception, it suffices to work with photographs of objects. The power and meaning of a picture of an object, according to the equivalency thesis, is exhausted by the power and meaning of that which is depicted. And so it goes without saying, for example, that Ramachandran, I think he also falls into the category of people we're allowed to beat up on. And so it goes without saying, for example, that Ramachandran takes himself to provide an account of why we value an 11th century bronze statuette of the goddess Parvati when he has shown that, for neuroevolutionary psychological reasons, we, supposedly, like full-figured women. And this notwithstanding the fact that, whatever else is true, it is clear that the statuette is not a full-figured woman. We can treat the statue, the depiction, as if it were a transparency through which we encounter that which it depicts. And this is justified by the equivalency thesis, or in this case specifically, the idea that the statuette is, neurologically speaking, the equivalent of a full-figured woman. The equivalency of a picture with what it depicts, however, is deeply implausible. It is one thing to see something, and another to see its depiction. That is, whatever we say about why pictures have representational powers, it better not commit us to the idea that pictures give us the experiences we would have if we were encountering whatever it is that they depict in the flesh. When you see a picture of something, you have a sense of its presence, despite the fact that it is manifestly, obviously, perceptually not present. You may see a full-figured woman in the statuette, but you're not in the same state you would be in if you were actually in the presence of a person. But in any case, there's a more pressing issue. Notice that Ramachandran's story leaves the artwork and its distinctive character out of the story. Everything we need to know about the art is clarified for him once we do our real work, which is, he believes, explaining the sources of our titillation. Ramachandran doesn't get so far as to offer an account of the specific work of art, with its distinctive look, patina, size, weight, religious significance, and so on. And this shouldn't be surprising. Just as I've suggested, the object falls out of consideration within the scope of neuroscience, so the art thing, the work itself, plays no role, is never brought into focus in at least this neuroaesthetics. Indeed, it isn't clear how the artwork makes an appearance in neuroaesthetics. After all, for neuroscience, objects are just triggers that are functionally equivalent to their neural representations. So the same is true of art objects. At best, they're triggers for events in the nervous system. The object itself screens itself off thanks to its effect on the nervous system. And so it shouldn't be surprising that researchers looking at our aesthetic response to sculptural form conduct their research in the absence of sculptures, confining themselves to pictures. Yeah. Or that scholars looking into the neural correlates of aesthetic experience identify aesthetic experiences as those triggered by the inspection of digital photographs of paintings. If the equivalency thesis is right, if a representation or picture is the neurological equivalent of that which it depicts, then the disappearance of the artwork itself from the study of art can be chalked up to good scientific method. But if we grant first that it's one thing to see a picture of something and another to encounter it in the flesh, and second, if we grant that when it comes to art, we are interested in part in creations that capture our attention directly and in their own material person, so to speak, and not merely as transparencies through which to encounter whatever it is that they represent, then we've got a problem on our hands. Neuroaesthetics seems unable to bring its own subject matter into focus as a subject of investigation. And this difficulty shows up already in the sorts of programmatic claims that Zecchi and others have made to the effect that, as Zecchi says, the laws of the brain constrain art. To support this, Zecchi adduces such facts as that Mondrian paintings exploit intricate details of human color perception and that no artist makes art from invisible light. The problem here is that the brain constrains our experience of art, according to this view, not because of anything distinctive to do with art or distinctive to do with the neural representation of art or to do with the experience, but just because the brain constrains our visual experience of anything that we might see. Now, I'm coming to the end. A more promising approach, probably, is to turn attention to aesthetic experience in order to investigate its neural correlates. Here are some concerns which I just want to throw out. First, let's suppose that there are neural correlates of aesthetic experience. A lot more needs to be said to show that these therefore have any explanatory significance. Here's an example from a different field. It has been claimed that there are differences in the brains of men and women. These differences are adduced as evidence that gender is hardwired. But the thing is, if there are differences between men and women, behaviorally, cognitively, experientially, I'm not assuming there are, but if there are, then it stands to reason that these differences would make a neurological difference. How could they not? But that doesn't rule out the possibility that it's social, cultural, environmental factors that drive the differences and explain them. And so I think with aesthetic experience, there may be neural correlates for everything. It remains to see what those correlates can teach us about the experience that interests us. Another problem, I think, and here I'm speaking directly, I think, to Gabby Starr, has to do with the difficulty of giving anything like marks or features that go with aesthetic experience. Some aesthetic encounters are moving, some are not. Some are moving one time but not another. Some are not moving until you've, so to speak, learned to get moved. Can we say that being moving picks out the aesthetic experiences? And can we rank those experiences on a 4-point scale? I don't think that we can operationalize aesthetics that way. And I expect that it's not an accident, but reveals something profound about what aesthetic experience is. Now, my worries here don't derive from my own externalist starting point. I mean, from my point of view, I don't think that perceptual experiences are in the head. I don't think aesthetic experiences would be either. But I think there's really something else going on here, which I hope my earlier remarks give us a framework for thinking about, coming to an end. A striking feature of aesthetic responses is that they are cognitive achievements, comparable, if not identical, to getting a joke. Think about how much knowledge, culturally specific knowledge, indeed knowledge about the telling of jokes that goes into one's ability to tell a joke. So my favorite short of example is 2 Irishmen come out of a bar. Yes, that can happen. Now, you laugh at that. Think about how much we need to know about jokes and their methods and their tempos and their rhythms, the genre of joke telling for that to be funny. That's an achievement of the intellect to laugh, to get it. I'm inclined to think that aesthetic responses are that kind of thing. Here's another feature of aesthetic responses. We have them not only in isolated encounter with works of art. We frequently learn to have them, and our responses are informed by what teachers, critics, friends, family, society, prestige, etc. tell us and invite us to think. They're informed by what we've seen before, and also by what we are interested in or happen to be doing. Aesthetic responses are not fixed data points. Not that you would have said that they are. They're not fixed data points, but they're rather like positions staked out in an ongoing conversation, ongoing in our lives and in our culture, also over historical time. Aesthetic responses are cultivated and they're nourished, and they're also challenged. And this brings me to the final feature. Aesthetic responses are judgments. We take stands on works of art. We don't just like them, even in the richest, most cultivated sense of what we might mean by like. We expect others to like them too. And if they don't, then we think that there's a lot that needs to be said. Art is experienced in the setting of argument, criticism, and persuasion. It was Kant's insight to realize that this is compatible with the fact that it may be essential that there's no way of adjudicating disputes in this area, that there are no decision procedures, no rules, no way of proving who's right and who's wrong. But the art and the response to art raises the question, who's right, nonetheless. Aesthetic responses, then, are not symptoms or reactions or stable quantities. They are actions. They are modes of participation. They are moments in a conversation. There is nothing about which we can even ask, I think, what are its neural correlates. And moreover, to look for the neural correlates is already to have turned our attention away from the aesthetic experience. So John Dewey said that the existence, I didn't write down the quote, he says, the existence of the art object gets in the way of our framing an adequate theory, and an adequate aesthetic theory. And I think it's exactly right. It's not about the objects. It's not about what the objects trigger in us. It's about what we do with them in a social context. So finally, my last sentence is, I think that neuroscience is too individualistic, too internalistic, too representationalistic, too idealistic, too anti-realistic to be a suitable technique for studying art. Thank you.